welcome you today to the plenary talk on the topic, the role of evidence and science in shaping and creating markets. It is our pleasure to introduce Dr. Jyotsna Puri, who is an expert in climate finance, international development and impact evaluation, with close to 30 years of experience in the multilateral sector. Till August 2024, Jo was the Associate Vice President of Strategy and Knowledge at the International Fund for Agricultural Development. In this role, she spearheaded the work on technical quality of IFAD operations and investments in more than 80 developing countries, while leading a 200-person global team. She was also the co-chair of the International Land Coalition 2022 to 2024. Most recently, she was strategic advisor to the president of IFAD, where she led the development of IFAD strategy 2025-2031 and its flagship rural development report focusing on financing rural transformation. Between 2017 to 2020, Jo was the inaugural head of the Independent Evaluation Office of the Green Climate Fund, or GCF. She oversaw the first performance review of the GCF that provided the blueprint for GCF's new strategy. She also initiated the Data Lab and the Behavioral Science Lab at the IEU. Jo has advocated for evidence-driven policies and programs at the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, where she was the Deputy Executive Director and Head of Evaluation. Jo is currently also an Adjunct Associate Professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, where she teaches development effectiveness, and is a Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C. Jo has played an instrumental role in conceptualizing resilience credits that provide a model for incentivizing financing for climate adaptation. She has contributed to several high-level policy groups within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UNEP. Dr. Puri has authored numerous academic articles and reports on climate resilience, impact evaluation, and innovation. She also serves on the Board of Innovations for Policy Action. Dr. Puri holds a PhD and MSc in Agriculture and Resource Economics from the University of Maryland, USA, and an MA in Development Economics from the Delhi School of Economics, India. We invite you to the stage now.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, first, thank you very much, Professor and Professor Tara and Professor Pintu and Pradeep and Sana for really having me here, for the very warm welcome, and for really taking care of so many things. And you know, I know from experience that conferences such as these require so much attention to detail, and I can say that you're definitely setting a very high standard. So thank you very much for having me here. What I want to do today is my talk. I think I was told that I should try and speak for about 25 minutes or 30 minutes. So I'm going to try and do that. But I have a few slides, but what I want to try and do is, I wasn't sure as to what the background of the audience would be, although Professor had told me, and I wanted to understand a little bit more about what you knew about econometrics and meta-analysis. So I might use the board as well in between to sort of explain a few things that we were doing as part of this work. This is still ongoing work. We've published a few technical notes around it, but it's, some of it is going to be published soon. A part of it is going to be published soon. So currently, this is, emerging work, and I'm really excited to be here, to be also listening to, hopefully, inputs from all of you and have a conversation and a dialogue with all of you about this. So the focus of today's talk for me is the role of data and evidence in shaping markets, and I'm going to particularly look at resilience in climate, an area that has been really close to my heart ever since I actually started at the Delhi School, where I did my master's thesis on the role of shipbuilding on the forests of the Western Ghats of India, but between 1750 and 1850. So it was a combination of economic history, without me knowing environmental history, deforestation, but also mercantilism, because it was shipbuilding. And at that time, Professor Dharma Kumar, yeah, so she was yes, exactly. So her key message to me was, Joe, you have to just go to Cambridge. Don't go to any other place. Everything else is inferior. So, yes, exactly. And she was, she was really one of the giants in this space, and someone who really inspired me. But the reason I'm telling you that story is that it started off with a little drop and a twinkle in my eye when I was thinking about how I wanted to bring economics and the environment and climate together. And ever since then, without actually that, ambitious intentionality that we all seem to think that we have in our careers, I've sort of veered towards this area, whether looking at economic policy when I was working at the World Bank, or looking at, or trying to understand environment and climate policy when I was working with the UN Development Program, or then as a research scientist at Columbia University at the Earth Institute. I focused very much on what has really made me passionate and has really driven the work that I've done is I want to understand what is credible. I want to know how we can manage trade-offs that are becoming even more manifest today between environment and climate on one side and economic growth on the other. And I really want to understand as to how organizations and people can make decisions. Because finally, and I apologize to all of the economists in this room, but economics is about understanding trade-offs. And you've got to understand, one of the key things that I've learned as well is that to understand trade-offs and how we make decisions, you've got to understand magnitudes. Because it's very easy to say, well, don't drill. Because, well, you're going to save forests. But you've got to understand what is the magnitude of that impact that's going to occur. It's a consequence of drilling on one side and of economic growth on the other. And try and see as to what those trade-offs are, and then hopefully have mitigation mechanisms that you can set up. Right? So economics is really the study of trade-offs, and this is how I explain it to my nephew, so I'm going to take it here. Here I'm talking about resilience and climate, and for those, I know that some of you do study climate at IIT as well, but I'm still at the risk of repeating some of the things that you already know. I just want to put it out there, that resilience is really the ability of a system or a community or a society to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt, or transfer. Essentially, the idea of recovering or rebuilding or taking on shocks that may be occurring. Now, of course, shocks could be climate shocks, or they could be non-climate shocks, right? And from my lens, obviously, I'm interested in climate shocks, but I also recognize, being very much steeped in household data and understanding how households work, that households on the ground don't distinguish between, a climate shock or a non-climate shock. For them, they just want to be resilient, right? Whether it's a macroeconomic shock that's occurring because you've got devaluation, or a microeconomic shock that's occurring because, well, you've had a tornado come, doesn't matter to them. What they want to just be able to do is to resist and respond and rebuild. And that ability is essentially the ability to recover, rebuild, and essentially what we define as resilience. But resilience can really be at the level of the individual, but it can also be at the level of the community. And the capacity, one of the key things as we look at the resilience literature is recognizing that while and especially in developing countries, we know that social networks are very strong and people depend on social networks to also be resilient, right? It's not just a function of your household characteristics or the health of your children or the income that you're bringing into the household that is making you resilient, but it is also the social networks that you're creating within a village, within a community, within a community that is also making you resilient. And one challenge of a lot of the resilience literature has been to recognize that most studies, mainly because of data, but also because of the lens that we have, tend to parse those or to decouple those. So they either look at social or community level resilience or individual level resilience, while the connections between the two are clear to most researchers, but it just becomes a challenge when you're trying to understand data. So just another throwback, one of the key things that we discovered when I was working at the World Bank was we were looking at the Living Standards Measurement Survey. This is the LSMS. For all of you who don't know, the Living Standards Measurement Survey really set, I think, the tone for household level data collection in a standardized way, much like the DHS across the world. And the World Bank also provided a lot of capacity building with respect to both data collection as well as data analysis to countries that were doing LSMS. And now it's essentially gone and countries can do LSMSs themselves. But the reason I picked that up is that when I was working at, for a poverty assessment, and this was being done in Guatemala. And there the question was really trying to understand what is the impact of road building on poverty. Now, you sit back and this is something that my mother would sort of say to me, well, that's a pretty obvious question, why are you asking it? So, but the challenge was trying to understand what is the magnitude of that impact. Long story short, the reason I brought this up is that a lot of surveys, including the LSMS at that point, did not have community level data or modules, right? They weren't looking at, well, what is the state of roads at the level of the community, or what are the state of social networks at the level of community. They were really asking individual household level questions. And that was a big challenge. So we, along with a whole lot of others, really introduced what is the community module on trying to understand public infrastructure and social networks within the LSMS. So along with Vietnam and Guatemala, those were the first two modules that were introduced on community level data collection into the LSMS, and this is in the late 1990s. So the reason that I brought that up is that a lot of surveys, instruments, etc., even traditionally, try and look at either household or at community level or at more aggregate levels, but very few try and combine them. And I think one of the strengths of now new data collection has been this, and of course with GIS you can start to really build models which are both individual as well as much more macro. But the second point I wanted to really comment on is that resilience is also a function of rural communities. The social structures that we have, because that allows us to respond to a variety of shocks, right? Now, I've been looking at resilience for a while. One of the key challenges, and I'm going to show you this chart, I think, is that every time I've gone to try and understand the impact of resilience-related interventions. So remember that I'm coming from a multilateral space or an international organization space. And the way we talk, and so this is a little bit of language, the way we talk about actions on the ground is we either call them interventions, because obviously international organizations are coming in, they're designing interventions on the ground, or they're designing projects. Projects can be groups of interventions, right? But every time I wanted to understand the impact of resilience, so far there's been very little sort of resilience-devoted departments in international organizations, right? You're either directed to, oh, why don't you go and speak to the water people? Because, guess what? One of the outcomes they're looking at is resilience. But obviously, what they're looking at is the availability, accessibility, affordability of good, clean water, right? But that's a very specific, sector-specific indicator for water. If you want to understand resilience a different way, then, oh, why don't you go and speak to the nutrition and food people? Because obviously, good health also makes you resilient. But the idea here is that it has been hugely fragmented. This idea of resilience, and again, I was speaking with the professor and also with Tara, to asking them as to what extent do students here really interact with other departments. The key challenge in actually a lot of research is that you tend to become so siloed And for someone who's working on food or who's working on, say, networks or finance, you're only looking at the problem from the context of the question that you're asking. So you're only looking at credit and financing, but you're not looking at the rest of the resilience, landscape. But clearly, for the person on the ground, resilience is a many splendid thing, right? You've got to bring together all of those things. I need to have good, clean water. I need to have education. I need to have good health. I need to have access to basic services. I need to have equity. All of that needs to come together so that we can truly be resilient. And so one of my many other rants is that, yes, we've got to start to think about research also from the context of the outcomes that we're looking at, right? Rather than looking at it from the disciplines, so looking at it in a siloed way in terms of, oh, well, yes, you're looking at water or education, start to look at it from the outcome, which obviously here is resilience. And then start to think about how do we parse it and start to make sense of it, right? And because that then, the whole of resilience is really greater than the sum of the parts that you are really building into it. Okay, so one challenge within the resilience literature, and now that I've basically ranted about how we are all siloed, I'm going to give you a little bit of data on climate and tell you as to how I keep wearing the climate lens all the time. But one challenge within the climate space has been to recognize that, so climate has two parts. Mitigation, and what's the other one? Adaptation. And so most of the money since Paris, so 2015 Paris, which is the Paris Agreement where 198 countries decided that they were going to come in and agree to having nationally determined contributions. They're going to have goals with respect to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, all of that. So that's the Paris Agreement. Is recognizing that a lot of the new and additional money, as well as the redirected money that has come into climate, has been that for mitigation. That is, renewable energy, reducing carbon dioxide by making everything low emission, increasing energy efficiency, but that's the mitigation part of climate. Adaptation, which is essentially about adapting, responding, recovering from shocks, has actually gotten very little money. And again, the underlying hypothesis to this is primarily because adaptation is so difficult to measure. So first I want to just show you this data. Right, so this is 2019-2020. There's actually 21-22 data as well, but I think it's pretty emblematic and illustrative of the big division that exists within the climate literature. I don't need you to read this chart. What I need you to do is to recognize a few things. The overall money that was coming into climate, which is additionally $653 billion, right, in that year, which is counted as additional and new. Now, of that, 586, and that's the fine print that I just need you to know. So the fine print is that of the 653, $586 billion was going into mitigation. Most of it was going into mitigation. Very little, 49 billion, going into adaptation. So clearly, even though countries had committed themselves to looking at adaptation and mitigation together, what we're seeing is a complete imbalance between the kinds of resources and the new financing that was getting mobilized, that is getting mobilized for mitigation versus adaptation, one, and two, recognizing also that a lot of the financing agencies in this space, so I used to work with the Green Climate Fund as well, which is the multilateral fund, the largest multilateral fund for climate set up after Paris, and located and headquartered in Songdo, Korea. But recognizing, so even in the Green Climate Fund, we recognize that most of the money that they were lending to countries or they were granting to countries was essentially going to mitigation. And I think a collective of us, our underlying hypothesis was and continues to be that this is primarily because you have now a great metric to understand how much carbon you're reducing in the atmosphere, right? You can measure. So if I am an investor, I come in, I put in $1, I know for every dollar what is the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that can occur, because now we've got good parameters, we know we have conversion factors, etc. So there's a pretty good way of understanding that. We don't have that for adaptation. I cannot say $1 invested will lead to 10% increase in resilience. Because guess what? I have to go and speak to the nutrition experts and the water experts and the infrastructure experts and the finance experts to try and understand, well, what has been the improvement in access to financing and affordability of financing and availability of financing, and then try and draw up metrics. So that's one of the key challenges really that has occurred in this space. So in the climate, in the resilience space, there has been, of course, there are a whole lot of other problems as well, and I'll summarize those, is that there has been a mismatch between demand and supply. India is a key example. A large part of the money that is required in India is really about adapting. Yeah? Most developing countries, and there are 155 developing countries in the world, are really looking for immediate adaptation resources. Yes, mitigation is important, but the impact of my mitigation action is only going to come about 50 years from now, and it's going to stay for another 100 years because that's the half-life of carbon, right? So I'm only, or 150 years. So it's basically what most developing countries really require are resources for adaptation and consequently resilience, but obviously it's easy to measure mitigation, and so that's where most of the money is going. Now, in economics, there's this demand and supply mismatch in climate. First is the quintessential problem of informational asymmetry. Asymmetry that's arising from knowledge gaps, different measurement structures in different parts of what is called the resilience framework, reporting templates, attribution. How do you attribute that this improvement in resilience has occurred as a consequence of this action or this intervention or this project? It's been phenomenally difficult. The second challenge has been constrained capacities, right? To structure projects that I can come and invest in, so-called, this is the term that you should start to learn if you want to come and work in the climate space, is bankable projects, right? That I have a rate of return that I can depend on from a project, and that's a bankable project. But there's been very few. I can go on about the challenges of bankable projects. The third is a lack of innovative financing mechanisms. So the inability to de-risk the perceived high riskiness really of investing in an area that requires adaptation financing. And we can talk about this if you're interested in thinking about risk and uncertainty in the Q&A. And last but not least is we have complexities that are related to the market. Clearly, adaptation and a lot of the consequence of it is that it is a true public good, even though we tend to not think of adaptation as a public good. If I'm a farmer, I'm investing in, say, nature-based solutions, the impact we think is only going to occur to the farmer. Actually, that's not true. There are going to be global and public benefits of investing in agroecology and nature-based solutions, and that is because my food supply is going to be far more secure as a consequence of investing in something that also helps me to adapt more, right? So this non-excludable, non-divisible nature of adaptation benefits has also been a challenge in setting up these markets. I should say right up front, so this is work that we started off. So I started off this work in GCF and then took it to IFAD, but then subsequently we also collaborated with Duke University. So this is work that we've done with them and also with the Ministry of International Cooperation in Egypt. Okay, so then this comes to essentially the big question of, okay, if these are the big challenges, can we solve it, right? So we all sort of put on our economist hat and said, okay, how can we really push forward? There are two ideas that I want to put forward. One is the idea of a resilience credit, which is, how many of you know a carbon credit? Hands up. Okay. And how many of you are working on carbon credits now? Interesting. So interesting because carbon credits and tradable carbon is becoming one of the key things, and I would really encourage you to think about it. But it made us think a lot more about, okay, if we want to create a market and if we really want to solve this problem of bringing in more investor money into adaptation and resilience, can we think of something that's called a resilience credit? So I just want to put it out there, prime you a little bit about what this credit is, and then we'll talk about this. So a resilience credit requires measuring resilience benefits using reliable methods that standardize and generalize across sectors and contexts, right? And the idea is that if we can generate a resilience credit, so if I invest in something that improves the resilience of not just me, but of all of you, so also the public good as well as the private good element, if we can measure that, then I can then sort of say, okay, because I'm going to do, say, a green farm and certify the products that I'm producing, and if Shelja is really interested in investing in or thinking about resilience and wants to also make all of us resilient, should be willing to buy it from me, because then that would encourage me to invest more in resilience, right? So that's the idea. It requires both me as provider of resilience credit, but it also requires Professor Shelja to be wanting to or demanding that credit, right? And we are clearly in the space where there is demand for resilience, because the number of shocks that are occurring, the number of conflicts that are occurring, the implications for food supply, poor water supply, the consequence of all climate as well as non-climate shocks are super high. So people want all of us to be adopting practices and actions that are making us resilient. So the demand is there. The challenge is, can we incentivize the supply? And so, okay, so then I want to introduce this idea of a resilience dividend. The resilience dividend is, something, and this is a pretty simplistic representation, but let me just walk you through it. Recognizing that, okay, if there is a disturbance, climate or non-climate, right, that occurs at time t equal to 0, and you're going along merrily on your pathway, and that's the horizontal line, and then suddenly a shock occurs, and this could be anything. This could be output, GNP, it could be water supply, whatever you want to measure, basically on your y-axis. But essentially, when you have a shock, again, it's predicated on this idea that a shock is, by definition, detrimental, so that you would actually veer away from what is your counterfactual scenario, and you would see a dip in your overall productive capacity, say, right? Say you're measuring productive capacity on your y-axis. So the idea of a resilience dividend is that if you invest in the households becoming far more resilient, that it would either, am I very loud? Okay. It would either improve the productive capacity or take them back to what their original state was, right? So the resilience dividend is the difference between the shocked state now and the counterfactual, which could have been either you're going along merrily on your pathway, or that you're still pretty badly off, but the difference between where you're now and what you could have been had you recovered. Right? So that's the resilience dividend. And then, so that's the adaptation and resilience, and then you see recovery. And this sort of spectrum is seen a lot in the humanitarian space as well, just for you to know, recovery and rebuilding. But the idea is that you can have different mechanisms of improving resilience. You reduce the magnitude of the disruption, right? What is the overall amount of shock that you're feeling? The duration of the disruption, and the duration, reducing the duration of recovery of from the disruption. So you could be affecting all or one or all of them, right? So that's what a overall intervention which is targeting resilience could do. Now, we put together this idea of ability to recover, the ATR index. Am I doing okay for time?
Yeah.
Okay. So think about this. I'm going to just walk you through the first equation, which is the shock exposure at the household level. So we're measuring it at the household level is equal to a dummy variable, which I will explain now, and the severity multiplied by the severity, where the dummy variable is one, whether you experienced a shock or not, and severity, again measured at the level of the household, is just trying to understand. Remember that welfare is all very subjective. Whether you feel that you're better off, worse off than you were before, whether you're the same as before, or you're better off than before as a consequence of the intervention, right? So a resilience measurement is based on the household's perceived ability to recover, because all welfare economics is all about perception. How do I feel? What is, how am I happy or not? So we've got to think about, we can go and have really good GIS data, and we do look at proxies with respect to infrastructure, with respect to quality of infrastructure, roads, etc. But then, and in a separate paper, we're also correlating that a lot of this with trying to understand other shocks that are occurring and trying to connect the subjective and the objective data. But I'm not going to talk about that today. And so we then put together a continuous ability to recover index, which is measured at the household level, but then aggregated to the community level. And this is an important part of this work, because we recognize that a community, it's really important to understand what's happening at the community level and not just at the household level. You may or may not have experienced a shock, but you may still believe that you're worse off after a shock. So it was really important to understand at the level of the community as to whether the community felt whether they were better off or worse off, right? And that helped us to also then consider as to how strong these social networks are. So we are measuring this data both at the community and the household level, and considering then also as to how strong these social networks are, which help us to recover far more, right? You have a shock, you go to your neighbor, can I borrow some of this? Can I borrow some clothes, etc.? And that's helping us as well to recover. So measuring that was really important. Now, sorry, my print is small, but I'm just going to walk you through it. So we have embedded within this work a few specific indicators. Remember that you'll recognize that I'm not looking at water, I'm not looking at food, I'm not looking at infrastructure, finance. I'm not talking about any of that. All I'm talking to the household's ability and perception with respect to their ability to recover, right? So one is the ability to recover from shocks, which is a subjective measurement, but then exposure to shocks can be both subjective, but also it can also be objective, right? I can look at the weather data from a particular village or a community and try and understand, and this is what we are doing in a paper, to what extent is the perception of shock, the exposure to shock, also highly correlated with objective measures of those shocks, because we can look at other data as well. And then trying to get data on livelihood and income diversification, number of shocks, and severity of shocks, right? And again, severity of shocks is both measured objectively as well as subjectively. Okay, so one key question that we ask in the survey is the measure of shock exposure that takes into account experience with the shock as well as severity. And this is what I was alluding to. And the question is, so of course there are a whole lot of other questions in the survey. The last time your household experienced said shock, and we look at 22 shocks. 22 shocks that go across climate as well as non-climate, right? Your income or food production decreased, 1, not at all, 2, a little, or 3, a lot, right? And so on for each one of those 22 shocks. And then the shock exposure is then the average perceived severity of all shocks that were experienced at the household level, right? And so that's essentially the equation that I showed before. So shock exposure is a product of the dummy variable where D is equal to 1 if the shock is experienced by the household and 0 otherwise, and the severity. So this is essentially showing you the same equation, but I wanted to link it to the question that we are asking in the survey. Okay, so then this is what I call the money slide, right? So now, don't look at my slide for a second. Yeah, so what I want to do is really, all of you know randomized control trials? No. Okay, so I'll just give you a 2-second brief on that. One is, so what a randomized control trial does is, suppose I want to understand what's happening with people in one area, and I want to understand what's happening. So what's happening to people here? I select what are called counterfactuals, right? So now, I won't go into the theory of this, but very important to recognize that counterfactuals have to be selected in a random way. You have to do what are called balance tests for them, so that you recognize that before the intervention occurs, the area where you're intervening is very similar to all of these other counterfactual areas across a whole panoply of indicators, right? So Rosen and Rubinstein essentially called it my senior moment, I will get to it. But essentially, you have an entire index, or we did a balance test across 32 variables to say, before the intervention occurred, the curse of dimensionality, right? So they call it the curse of dimensionality. You can't keep measuring every little attribute of this area with every little attribute here. So what you create is an index for this area, and you compare that index across, because if you start to do each one and one, then that's the curse of dimensionality. So essentially, you create these counterfactuals, and you make sure that they are identical before your intervention occurs. So that's the first thing that you do essentially in a randomized control trial. Okay. So with the work that we are doing at IFAD, or the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which works in 80 countries, we wanted to understand, well, what is the impact of all of these interventions on the resilience or the ability to recover in the areas that we're working in. So for a randomized selection, and this is really important, the randomization from the sample. So we had a sample, our universe goes across $8 billion of investments, right? And we picked projects or investment areas that were randomly selected for equivalent to approximately $1 billion, right? But they were randomly selected, and this led to approximately 25 project areas. So 25 project areas in developing countries across the world. In those areas, we selected, essentially, we knew as to where, well, we as a research team, so very independent from the operational team, knew as to that we needed to select these counterfactual areas so that we could understand what was the difference between, so at time t equal to 0 is when the intervention occurs. But we are measuring the impact of our resilience indicators, say at time t equal to 10. That's 10 years. So actually it was, on average, it was 8.5 years. So after 8.5 years, we wanted to know, well, what is the resilience? Has that improved or not? And we selected these areas for measuring what was the status of these counterfactual areas and compared them with what was happening in this area after 8.5 years, right? And so any difference that you would see between these, and this is the really cool part of randomized control trials, is essentially saying, because you selected randomly, you did your balance test, and actually if you truly randomized where you were targeting your interventions, you wouldn't even have to do balance tests. If you were truly randomized across this entire sample as to where you were taking your project areas, you wouldn't have to do any balance tests. You could just say with surety that yes, that they were identical, right? And that's the power of randomness. But essentially, in 8.5 years, then we wanted to see what's happened here and compare them with what's happening in the counterfactual areas that had been selected. And you select more than one, because otherwise you're subject to statistical error as well, right? So that's the first thing that I wanted you to understand, that the average effect size, the effect size is essentially what's happening in my treatment area minus what's happening in my counterfactual area, right? But my counterfactuals are 1 to 10. So I can have 10 comparison areas or counterfactual areas, and I take an average of those and then compare them with what is happening in my treatment area. My treatment area is where I took the project. Yeah? And that's essentially my effect size. And then you also do tests to understand whether these are statistically significant or not. So that's the first. And then the second idea is that of a meta-analysis. Everybody know what a meta-analysis is? Someone? Hands up for those who know what a meta-analysis is. I won't pull you to the board. Or I might. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the other idea is that, okay, suppose I have this for one site, right? But now I want to understand, well, it happened, I improved in one site. Did I improve across all my sites? So then I pool all of that data and I do what's called a meta-analysis, but I'm going to show that now. Okay, so now if you look at my slide, this is what is called a forest plot. Okay, a forest plot essentially, so each one of these rows is a site or an intervention area, right? Now you can't read my fine print, but essentially the first row is a project in Tajikistan, the second one Argentina, the third Ghana, Kyrgyzstan, they're all written like that. So these are 25 projects. Okay. Now each one of these, and this is the cool thing about meta-analysis, each one of these is essentially showing me, one, what is the effect size? So this little diamond, small diamonds, they're showing me the effect size. If they lie to the right of my line of unity, it essentially means that the likelihood of success is greater than the likelihood of failure, or my odds ratio is greater than 1. Right? And so what you can see here, so if the diamond lies to the right of unity, that means the project is considered a success, right? I'm going to say that simplistically. You can see actually there's some projects that where the diamond, these little diamonds, lie on the left side of the line of unity. What that means is that actually the odds ratio is less than 1. That means that we were probably better off not intervening there. They would have been better off without EFAD money than they are now. Right? That's basically what it's telling you. So it forced us to confront this idea that, yeah, we could actually be doing harm in some areas. The second idea is this line, right? So this is essentially showing me my standard error. What's the variance of my effect size, right? Now the important thing is to recognize that if this standard error line crosses my line of unity, it basically is that I cannot distinguish it from my null hypothesis, which means that I've had no impact whatsoever. Okay? So that's essentially, and you can see, so it was quite well measured. Now, this meta-analysis essentially takes all my 25 sites, pulls that data, re-estimates all the effect size, and then puts it on this forest plot. The important thing is what happens when you pool all of this data and you re-estimate it. The smallest part of this chart is the most interesting part. This is my average effect size. So this, each one is my effect size for a project. This is my average effect size. This diamond and the width of that diamond is essentially showing you, one, what is the magnitude of the change that occurred as a consequence of EFAD interventions. Yeah? Second, the width of that is showing you how confident can I be in that measurement. Right? So it's essentially, this is pretty well measured. And what we essentially found after we pulled that data is that the average effect size as a consequence of EFAD's investments in more than 25 sites, as measured from its ability to recover from shocks and as measured from the difference from by aggregating the difference of what happened in the treatment area versus the counterfactual areas, was 14%. And that was sort of the penny drop moment. And this is why I sort of call this the money slide. We realized that now we could start to think very much about, what was the impact of $1 on improved resilience, right? Because now we have a way to measure it, and we can actually say, this is attributable. This is the other power of impact evaluations, that you can attribute the effect to the intervention. And that's because we are measuring it using counterfactuals, using this treatment and this treatment effect. Okay, so then this leads me to essentially this idea of resilience credits, right? The idea, so now see again, what we essentially have is the ability to measure what's happening as a consequence of my resilience investment on one side. We know that we've got lots of investors wanting to come in and invest in resilience, because resilience is not just a private good, but it's also a public good. And so we've got the two things that are required for making a resilience market. And so this essentially, I'm going to just show you what that finance market could look like. And yeah, as economists, we don't think too much about making markets, but I want to push that a little bit. Okay. So let's start with the farmer. This is a small farmer, yeah, smallholder farmer, SHF, smallholder farmer. Okay. So they want to make resilience investments, okay? They want to invest in diversified crops. They want to take up agroecology. I'm just giving you examples. They want to eat better, etc. They want to do all of that. But they don't have money to do it, because they have to also then make a lot of input investments. So the idea is that we bring in intermediaries or local banks who invest in resilience investments, and the smallholder farmer borrows from these intermediaries or local banks, where international or even public banks essentially put together a financing mechanism which advance what's called blended capital. For all of you who are interested in blended capital, I will do another sort of aside on what's blended capital. Essentially what that means is that you're putting together different risk appetites to put together an entire platform that helps to put money out. But don't worry about it. This is incidental for now. But the reason that the measurement of resilience is helpful is that now you can measure the improvement in resilience, and almost as a results-based financing mechanism, the intermediary can say, look, we will invest in you, we will give you a loan, if you are able to improve your resilience by 10% or 15%. Why will they care? They care because they're investing in the smallholder farmer, right? And they want the return on their investment. So they will care because they want the smallholder farmer, or the rural person, or the poor person, etc., to be better off, because that means that their investment is insured, right? They will get a return on it. So they've got incentive as well. Now, along with this, there are now an increasing breed of investors who are coming in who really are thinking about, much like that local intermediary, who are thinking, oh yeah, we really want to invest in resilience, because guess what? Our food supply will now become less jeopardized, less disrupted, less variable, less uncertain if we start to invest in it, right? So the resilience credit investor essentially because now we can measure the overall improvement in resilience, you generate a resilience credit, you create this marketplace where you aggregate lots of smallholder farmers coming together. You have millions of resilience credits, and the resilience credit investor essentially says, great, I'm investing in this area as well. Let me invest in buying these resilience credits and therefore put money. So the yellow lines are all the dollar movements, and the green lines are essentially showing as to where the resilience credits are flowing, right? So this is, because we've now been able to measure resilience, This is essentially the setting up of a marketplace where you have a lot of people coming together who otherwise would not get compensated or incentivized for investing in resilience actions. Now you've got a market for it because you've been able to measure it. The big question, the other question is, well, how much would this cost? So anybody know what a carbon credit costs right now? What the price of a carbon credit is in the market? Okay, well, that's an unfair question because last week when I checked, it was $80 a ton. It's not a small amount, right? For a person who's an individual farmer, etc., if you're generating even 1 ton or mitigating 1 ton of carbon, you now are suddenly getting $80 in the carbon market. That's a pretty big improvement in your overall income stream. So the idea is, but of course, pricing it, as most economists know, occurs only when you intersect your demand and supply curves. That's when you know when the market clears, and that's how you determine your price, right? So what is it worthy to whom? So we thought of different ways, and this is what we're going to be piloting with the Ministry of International Cooperation in Egypt and many others, is let's try and understand what is it worth to many. Now, with carbon, the key advantage is that you've got a cap and trade mechanism. You know the amount of carbon that the earth can take on, right? That's your limit. So that will then essentially say, okay, now a price gets generated because you want to incentivize people to not emit carbon. But for adaptation, we don't have that limit, not yet anyway. So then the other way to price this is to use what I call willingness to pay mechanisms to try and understand what that could do. So what is for the farmer, the way to price it is, what is the financial value of the investment that improves their resilience, which is their willingness to pay. For the investor, what is it that you would prevent for them, and how much are they willing to pay for their resilience credit investor? And similarly for the financial aggregator, as well as for the international organization, which would be the market maker in this case. Look, much work has been done. For those of you who know the climate literature, a lot of indicators have been put forward. And I put this chart just so that I could show you some work that has been done. There are green water credits, there are blue credits, there are biodiversity credits, there's an adaptation benefits mechanism. We asked Duke actually to do an independent review of what they thought, how a resilience credit mechanism really compares with all others. And they set up a whole list of criteria, the extent to which it addresses climate vulnerability, market-based approaches, to what extent it is standardized, is open to third-party verification, etc. And they found that a resilience credit actually is quite good compared to a lot of the other indicators. So I'm coming to the end of my talk. The way forward, we are now piloting this idea of resilience credits with organizations as well as countries, including Egypt, but others such as Citi, etc., interested to try and see as to how we could take it forward. I'm hoping we'll take it forward at UNEP as well in Nairobi. So this is the pilot testing space, and the idea will be to see as to how we can bundle it for people to start to think at the pilot stage and then try and scale it up into markets. But much like the carbon space, we expect that much of it will be voluntary at the beginning, right? And then you start to think about it in a compliance-based way. Thank you. Yes, of course. I need your pen. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for an absolutely fascinating talk. So your talk just very nicely complemented the first keynote. And I raised a question there. It's a Stiglitz question from the last year's paper on carbon. And his point was, in that paper, in response to the Dubai COP, that economists, and so he was obviously including himself in the breed, all of us, we always like having a single solution. So at the moment, his concern is that using carbon prices as a first best solution prevents us from creating a market. But you have answered precisely the other side. What is it that we need to do to bring in the resilience? So the analogy is, of course, in the UK, we're suffering this. We're going for net zero, reduced production, mitigation, adaptation. But we're not doing it for consumers because we're not thinking about the cost of how they're using energy. And obviously, you've got a really nice idea of thinking about how they manage with shocks. But is there a way of bringing how they use energy into this to actually set aside what Stiglitz says we need a portfolio approach? We can't do carbon without the others. So big question, but Stiglitz put it out there, so we've all got to answer it now. So that's the question.
Should I take one by one, or should I take a few?
Whatever you'd like to do. Want to take a couple?
Yeah, should we do? Yeah, that's a great question, Shelja. I'm going to come to it. And if you could also introduce yourself.
I'm Shatwik. I'm one of the organizers, Young Scholar Initiative.
Thank you, Shatwik.
I'm just so I have two questions. First is that how do you see property rights, especially when you're dealing with land? Any resilient system often deals with property of individual owners and their resistance or welcoming decision towards it. The second thing, I was wondering, how do you place power and politics in your equation? In the end, so we did a working paper for UN Voider. So we saw how voting patterns are changing and how elections are being won or lost. So there is a tendency that whoever wants to remain in power, they want to build something instead of doing something which is difficult to identify. So if nutrition is increasing, it's very difficult to measure. But if you can build a bridge and then next time you go and say, I built the bridge, give me the vote. So how do you think we manage this elephant in that room? Yeah, thank you.
Great question. One more and then I'll try and take. So I'll take three in that.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Puri, for such an interesting talk. So I have two questions.
Could you say who you are?
Yeah, I am Shomita. I am one of the PhD scholars from IIT Bombay only. So I wanted to ask you, one thing is that in your adaptation index, many a times what happens is because of repeated cyclones or any other climate shocks, people tend to be displaced or forcibly become migrants. So does the adaptation index take care of the migration aspect? That is one. And the second is, many of the times the resilience also comes from the marginalized communities for whom the very regional information is often absent in the formal data sets. So can we address that also through this? Thank you.
Wow, great question. So let me start with Professor Shelja first. If Joseph Stiglitz can't answer it, I'm going to take a crack at it. Actually, jokes aside, one of the key things, I also sit on the expert group for the Adaptation Gap Report, and one of the key things that we are looking at and we're really pushing the adaptation report to recognize is that there are co-benefits, right? And so one impact, and you will notice that in some of the examples that I was using, agroforestry, nature-based solutions, etc., clearly the co-benefit is carbon mitigation, and that is greenhouse gas mitigation, and that is the co-benefit of investing in greater adaptation. So it's not actually a trade-off. And so one of our reviewers actually said that the reason that they liked resilience credits was that because now you could actually build the carbon part into the index and sort of say, okay, what impact is it having on carbon and what impact is it having on resilience, and sort of combine it rather than saying, oh, this is for adaptation and this is for mitigation. So we think that that's one of the powers of the index, and we could, because this is outcome agnostic, right? In the sense that it's pathway agnostic. It doesn't say, oh yeah, I have to go through nutrition or I have to go through infrastructure or credit or etc. It's completely pathway agnostic, and we just want to understand what the outcome is and which has to be of resilience. So yes, we can incorporate that hugely. Maybe I should drop him a note. Okay, Satwik. Your two questions were, does this incorporate, I'm going to paraphrase, property rights, and second, how does politics and power fail us? Okay. So property rights, great question. my PhD was on looking at property rights and property rights in Thailand within reserved areas. So one of the key, again, big reveal moments for me was recognizing that property rights are not a binary thing. It's not like you have a property right and you don't, right? In Thailand, within the areas that we were looking at, there were 7 kinds of property rights. So from zero title and zero usability, or to just user rights, but then, oh yes, I can send to my children, but it can be inherited, but it can't be sold, or it can just be sold, and then all the way to complete property rights where you have the entire title and everything, right? And you have complete rights. So recognizing that first, property rights is a spectrum. And second, that of course the literature, especially within development economics, of the connection between property rights on one side and investment on the other, right? So you recognize that, and this has been the big challenge in India, where if you don't have secure property rights, you don't invest in the land, right? So that's sort of the very simple sort of development literature relationship that we have. I think in one way it gets around to that. Gets around that problem of having secure property rights, which should not be interpreted to say that I don't believe that property rights should be secure, and especially for the marginalized, absolutely should be. But just to say that if you start to put incentives on how I treat my land, whether I increase soil fertility or not, and really looking at the outcome with respect to my productivity, etc., and my resilience, then I'm actually building an incentive for the farmer or for the household to be investing in the fertility of soil, right? Which is irrespective whether I have full property rights to that plot of land or not. So in one way, you're getting around it, but I don't want it to be used as an argument for absence of property rights. So yes. The second is, politics and power. Great examples. I'm actually going to use your example of, nutrition. I do think, and again, I have a bias, which is I believe that what you measure is what you manage. Unless you don't have good measurements and that's what the resilience paper tries to address, that because we did not have good measures of resilience, there wasn't a lot of investment going in. I think with nutrition, this is happening. You have food insecurity indicators, you have malnutrition indicators, you have food dietary diversity indicators. So in our own work, we're taking minimum dietary diversity scores to really understand as to what is happening. And that's changing even the investor landscape, right? So we put out, IFAD put out the first of its kind nutrition bonds, right? So basically the investor, when you put out a bond, the investor's coming in to say, yes, we want to see the result with respect to nutrition, and we know you can measure it really well. So it's almost like results-based financing, right? I will pay if you show to me that this impact has occurred. So I think that with a lot of these measurement technologies, with AI, with GIS, I think we're going to be able to solve a lot of that now, because we'll be able to bring in different sorts of data sets. Earlier, I had to look at my GIS and look at photographs, go do ground truth, and try and bring in my survey data, and have a phenomenally hard time trying to combine all of that with AI. I can merge all of that, right? So I do think that hopefully the other side of the ugly underbelly of AI that we're all cognizant of is also recognizing that now we can measure and therefore treasure better. And Shomita, thank you. Displaced migration and marginalized populations. So it's a great question, because obviously there's a selection bias, right? If I don't look at the people that have either perished as a consequence of the shock or who have migrated, my indicator is going to be biased. And this actually, most household surveys that are done post-conflict, post-event, post-shock, suffer from this, that they underreport the consequences of the shock because people have migrated and or perished, right? So I think that's going to be a challenge. We're cognizant of it, and the way we design our survey instrument will have to take that on board. The same thing for migration and for I didn't quite understand the marginalized population part, but I think the way you meant it is, will you be able to track and include them in your survey instruments? So I think the answer is yes. We actually make it a point to look at especially marginalized groups because we know that they are far more vulnerable and therefore are going to be witnessing the severity of these shocks far more compared to the others. So actually we oversample for those that are marginalized. Yes, absolutely, Professor.
Yeah, I'm Lavanya. Thank you, ma'am, for touching upon the topic of, I'm PhD scholar at Department of Economics, IIT Bombay. Thank you for touching upon the topic on resilience. So the recent literature is revolving around resilience credit, resilience dividend, and resilient insurance. So as a researcher, we see a lot of models that are developing in this domain. But in order to test the impact of this, either GCF or UNFCCC, are they willing to check this impact while they disburse the amount to the developing nations? So that is one.
Great question. Sorry, let's take one more. Yeah.
I'm Satish Kumar. I'm doing PhD at ADCPS.
Hi, Steve.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. My question is associated with the previous question the people asked. Is when you talk about these developing indicators of resilience and including everything, at what extent you also include the concept and the idea of resilience from the grassroots level? Every communities have their own ideas of resilience, and when you try to mainstream these concepts, somewhere those concepts has lost.
Yeah.
So how you try to include those concepts while determining a broader or holistic understanding of resilience?
Yeah, great question again. Okay, Lavanya, so yes, would GCF and UNFCCC be interested in looking at this? So UNFCCC actually, the Director of Adaptation, he's part of our advisory board, and he is very much interested in trying to see as to how we can possibly integrate resilience credits into even the UNFCCC text, etc. Obviously, that's the politics of that is trying to get 198 countries to agree to changes in text when they can't agree that yes, actually climate change is occurring. A little bit tough, but we're working on it. But yeah, so GCF, I think they'd be quite interested. Right now, the indicator that they use for adaptation is number of lives improved of vulnerable people, which is a rubbish indicator. And I've sort of said it to them even when I was at the GCF that this is really terrible. Indicators are a necessary evil, and this definitely shows the evil part of indicators. So I think if they can bring on something far more rigorous, we'd be supportive. But I have to confess, we haven't started to talk to them yet. So when I was at GCF, they know my opinion about their current indicators, but we haven't started to talk because we also want to pilot it outside of EFAD. So at EFAD, I should say, that we used this framework then to extrapolate because it was random. So we extrapolated it across our $8.5 billion portfolio and then tried to also understand what was the impact at the portfolio level. And so one of our things also to impact investors is to say, look, you could think about resilience investments where you're not looking at every single investment, but at the portfolio level, we could guarantee you these results, right? Which is a 10% improvement in resilience, which is what we're doing here. So yeah, that's the idea and that's the offer. And Satish, great question. Resilience is, again, as I said, many splendid thing because everybody has their own vision of what is resilience. And that's why we want, in a subsequent paper that hopefully will soon get published, our indicator is subjective, right? Are you better off, same, or worse off than before? Which then brings in the perceptions and irrespective of whether you're living in a marginalized community, indigenous person, etc. But then we also combine that with objective data to see whether the shocks occurred, what the severity was, etc. And there's a pretty high correlation actually, we find. So I think the answer to your question is, yes, it incorporates things that are local and personal and subjective, but we are also merging this and correlating this with objective data to see as to how robust our inferences are. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
As a token of our appreciation, small memento so that you keep coming to the Department of
Oh, I'd love that. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. This was amazing. Thank you.
Can you imagine you had jet lag? You're doing a great job.
Exactly.
Oh, you're very kind. Very kind.
So sorry,
I wanna
in the middle of the night.
No,
So
but
we
it's
were
my
trying to keep
fault.
it
I
by
wanted to
noon.
actually